Hello and welcome. I'm Dawar Butt, and I'm your host at Front Seat to Climate Change. Pakistan is one of the most vulnerable countries when it comes to climate change, from deadly floods to heat waves that dry out rivers and leave no drinking water. Now, given the situations of the last few weeks, it's urgent to discuss what we all have been thinking about, the Indus River Basin. Signed in 1960, the Indus Water Treaty was a breakthrough agreement between India and Pakistan on the governance and administration of the Indus River Basin. Pakistan was given rights over the three western rivers, while India was given rights to three eastern rivers. India was allowed the limited use of the western rivers, largely of run-of-the-river dams. Pakistan received financing and support from its multilateral partners to build dams, barrages, and canals to support its own irrigation and water needs. The treaty has been more than just a stabilizing force. It has survived wars, including 1965, 71, the Kargil conflict in 1998. But in April 2025, for the first time, the treaty is in jeopardy. Following a terrorist attack in Pahalgam in Kashmir, India has decided to hold the Indus Water Treaty in abeyance.
Recognizing the seriousness of this terrorist attack, the CCS decided upon the following measures. The Indus Waters Treaty of 1960 will be held in abeyance with immediate effect until Pakistan credibly and irrevocably abjures its support for cross-border terrorism.
In abeyance, of course, is a rather technical word, but essentially what India says is that it no longer wants to abide by the Indus Water Treaty, not during wars, not during diplomatic breakdowns, not during conflicts. The Indus Water Treaty has stood its ground. Now, it's questionable, and Pakistan is left with very few options. Discuss and delve more into the legal technicalities. We will talk to legal expert for international law, Ayesha Malik, who spoke about the importance of the Indus Water Treaty and how it has been essential in the management of the Indus River Basin, especially for Pakistan given its low riparian state. But now with the breakdown of this treaty, it's important to consider various international law aspects as well as examples of other treaties which have so far stood the ground of conflict and wars.
Hi, Ayesha. Welcome to the show. Let me jump into the key issues here. Number one, we know that India's excuse or India's reasoning for pulling out of this treaty has been the security concerns after the Pahalgam terrorist attack, and which it is to an extent also blaming on the Pakistani state, but we know that there's no proof on the table right now. So, do you think these security concerns are valid enough to pull out of treaty that's survived 70 years?
Oh, yeah, absolutely, they're not. So India's justification for suspending the treaty is kind of relied on language from the law of treaties, which include a fundamental change of circumstances and the notion that cross-border terrorism gets in the way of Pakistan's ability to comply with its obligations under the Indus Waters Treaty. So they're kind of merging these two together, saying that there's been a fundamental change of circumstances in which they include their own population growth and climate issues, as well as Pakistan's supposed support of cross-border terrorism. The treaty itself does not include any way in which you could conflate any kind of security concerns with water issues that the treaty was there to address. So the fact that they're trying to rest this case on the fact that Pakistan has supposedly breached the Indus Waters Treaty through terrorism is something which does not comply with any of the provisions that we see in the Indus Waters Treaty itself. The reliance on treaty law as well is on very, very shaky ground in terms of there has not been a fundamental change of circumstances. We know that the Indus Waters Treaty was negotiated over a period of nearly a decade after Pakistan and India had already engaged in wars. And the fact that you already had 2016, the Uri attack, and the 2019 Pulwama attack, and yet we saw no fundamental change in circumstances there. How can you argue this now after the most recent attack, which, again, there is not a shred of evidence to say that Pakistan was involved in?
And besides that, I think the language in the press statements, especially by the Ministry of External Affairs of India, has used the term in abeyance, which also created some confusion because given that the IWT's own language does not really provide for an opportunity for either of the parties or the tripartite agreement to create the situation where either can hold it in abeyance. So, what does that really mean, in legal terms?
So in legal terms, we're as confused as everybody else in terms of India's use of this term. In abeyance, we take to mean that they've suspended their operations under the treaty in terms of that they're not going to fulfill their obligations because they're responding to what they perceive to be an internationally wrongful act from Pakistan. Under the treaty, as you rightly pointed out, there is no provision for suspension. It is very normal for treaties to have a provision for suspension. This was on purpose left out during the negotiations, and what they decided was you can modify the treaty so long as you're modifying it with another treaty by the consent of the two states, and you can terminate the treaty so long as you have another treaty to replace this treaty, again with the agreement of both states. So this unilateral action, Pakistan argues, rightly so under international law, is a material breach of the Indus Waters Treaty, which by its object and purpose says that you cannot do such a thing. It does not include a provision for that. And its object and purpose is also frustrated by this material breach by India because the focus was so readily on the cooperation between the two states, which now India has completely withdrawn from.
And this then brings Pakistan to the question of what can we do now. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs, both the deputy prime ministers and the prime minister has called this an act of war. And I think we do have precedents where lower riparian states take this as an act of war in case of the use of water, either by withholding it or by using it for different purposes, such as releasing excesses. So, as a low riparian state, does this, really be taken as an act of war under the treaty or international law, or is this an interpretation that we are rightfully taking right now?
Yeah, so this is something that I've been looking at recently in particular. An act of war under international law, what we mean by that is an act of aggression, which usually involves an armed attack, which means that there must be armed force used. And traditionally, what we've thought about when that happens is bombs, bullets, or even now, the law has evolved in terms of interpretation that we now include cyber operations, so long as they have a kinetic effect, which is similar to that which can be caused by traditional warfare. The fact that Pakistan is calling this an act of war, I really feel like war lawyers have been talking about this actually since 2020. A very well-known scholar, Craig Martin, he first raised the issue that the weaponization of water in particular could lead to lower riparian states, or even the fact of how we're seeing climate change evolve recently means that what will happen to those states when they see an existential crisis by the fact that water is being weaponized as such. Now, Pakistan has been one of the states to say that we will take that as an act of war. The current laws relating to the use of force have not evolved to the point that we see that yet, but it could be that the future wars that Craig Martin was warning about, those are here for Pakistan already. It is already existential for us. So it is about whether the law can keep up with states' concerns in this area. I do think that Pakistan has an argument to make in how much it will affect civilian populations and how much it will do actually more damage than perhaps bombs and bullets can do to Pakistani civilians.
I think even in the broader view, there is concerns that this is most likely the first instance where this party has, also tried to suggest that it can stop water if it wants to, and it can release excess water. But this perhaps also sets a precedent that other countries with similar disputes or similar treaties are now sort of in open season. Particularly, for example, China and India do not have a treaty right now, but China has always tried to not engage in water conflicts. Similarly, in the North African region, you have the Nile River, you have the White Nile River, which have similar water issues. And again, for centuries, the conflict has been resolved in Europe right now, but the Danube River, the other rivers, which multiple states share. So do you think that in terms of future projections where water availability will be an issue, countries can use this precedent to possibly take actions against, or just to even safeguard their own rights? This can lead to bigger conflicts as well.
Definitely, and I think that's why the Security Council needs to take cognizance of this, because it is such a threat to international peace and security. Now, we have seen states, especially those with friendlier neighbors, coming together, such as the Central Asian states, which have a 5-party water sharing agreement between them. We also see not tensions or conflict in the same way, but between Mexico and the US, where they have a very interesting treaty where they share the Rio Grande water and the Colorado River water. And currently the US has said, we're not going to send you guys water because you've only fulfilled 30% of your obligations, and our farmers in the south of the USA need that water. And so we're going to see these tensions escalate more. And as you pointed out, the Nile River is something that we compare Pakistan and India's situation to that of Ethiopia and Egypt under the Nile River, and the fact that they're lower riparian state a lot. But lower riparian states are going to be in a very difficult situation going forward, in the sense that the weaponization of water, I believe, is just going to get worse. And even in terms of shutting off the water, we know that India did that. It violated the standstill agreement to do that in 1950, which is why you had David Lilithgrow come and say, we need to have the World Bank involved in this, and then they negotiated the Indus Waters Treaty over a period of time. So back in the 1950s, India did manage to divert and shut off some of the water coming to Pakistan. And at the time, we had an agreement whereby we were paying for that water. And now we're like, no, the Indus Water Basin is largely in Pakistan. We need that water. And they had to ensure that, fine, you can use it in terms of your dams, in terms of hydroelectric power, but you have to ensure that the rivers flow to Pakistan. And where you don't have a powerful Security Council to come in the way and decide these issues, especially one paralyzed by the permanent members of the Security Council, the options in terms of where Pakistan can go are quite limited. Thankfully, under the Indus Waters Treaty, we have options with the World Bank as a guarantor to go and approach the World Bank and to go to the Court of Arbitration, which is what Pakistan will be looking to do now. But otherwise, we have seen cases at the International Court of Justice where states have come forward. So we had the Gabčíkovo Dam case between Hungary and Slovakia. We had Costa Rica take Nicaragua to the court for similar water-related issues, and the pulp mill case between Argentina and Uruguay. The issue in this case is that India has watertight reservations to the ICJ's jurisdiction. So the ICJ would not be an option for us unless we get an advisory opinion similar to what we've been seeing when it comes to Israel-Palestine, that the Global South states in particular managed to push the ICJ to give advisory opinions on the lawfulness of Israel's occupation, and now on the presence of international organizations, including the UN and UNRWA, in occupied territory and Israel's obligations to it. So in terms of forms, thankfully, because of the IWT, we have the form of a court of arbitration. But I do suspect that we're going to see more and more cases like this before the ICJ, which will be very helpful for us in determining what the legal principles are which apply. Because especially when it comes to climate change law, they're quite wishy-washy. They're not incredibly, they're quite vague, and they're not incredibly delimiting onto what states can do. So the duty to cooperate, but what does the duty to cooperate actually mean? And we need the ICJ to really hone in on these, and probably we're going to see them in other situations before we see them between India and Pakistan.
Thank you so much for your answers. I think this was quite comprehensive, gives a lot of clarity on what options Pakistan has, and perhaps while remaining within the ambit of international law. So thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to have you on this show whenever we need your guidance. Thank you.
That was Ayesha Malik offering insight into the Indus Waters Treaty and what it could mean for Pakistan in the coming couple of months or even years. The legal precedent, what Pakistan can possibly do, how other treaties have survived various violence, conflict, and diplomatic breakdowns. Everyone, welcome back. We've looked at the brewing water conflict between India and Pakistan and the legal dimensions. But of course, the big elephant in the room, climate change, changing climatology, hydrology of the Indus River Basin, erratic monsoon patterns, and of course, without the treaty, sharing of data and important information, this breakdown will possibly impact Pakistan as well as the communities around the Indus as it falls downstream. We spoke to Ali Tauqeer Sheikh, who is a climate change expert and has deep knowledge about the Indus Waters Treaty, various agreements Pakistan has so far set in place, the conservation strategy, and of course, he has been involved in bilateral forums as well. Thank you for joining us, Ali. And I think the key question, especially for a lot of Pakistanis right now, those dependent on the river itself, is that the Indus Basin has always been quite dependent on glacial melt, snow melt in the Himalayas, in the Karakoram, and the rivers that are given to Pakistan under the Water Treaty, particularly Chenab, Jhelum, these are heavily dependent on the flows coming from the Himalayas. Now, given climate change and the impacts that we've already been facing, both in terms of flooding and the droughts this year, how do you think that Indus Basin's future looks like, where you also have the consequences of climate change, but you might also have the additional impact of not sharing data, not sharing the information that can potentially safeguard a lot of the impacts that low riparian country like Pakistan can face?
See, it's a lifeline for Pakistan because we are more or less single water basin country. And you are absolutely right. We depend for a very high percentage of our water coming from Indus. And increased precipitation and temperatures have changed the patterns of snowfall and snow melt. And therefore, what we see is that instead of the regular snowing season and melting season and monsoon season, there are variations in the flows, and there is a greater degree of fluctuation in the availability and uncertainty. Our typical weeks, when we'll say that we expect, let's say, winter rains, if they don't happen, it during that period doesn't mean that we have missed winter rains. It may mean that we'll get 2 weeks later, or may mean a drought year. So the biggest impact of climate change is the degree of uncertainty. And that degree of uncertainty makes it very, very difficult for the policymakers as well as for the farmers who are the actual users of the water. So in a nutshell, if I have to tell you, there are increased number of heat waves resulting in off-season heavy water flows coming from the upper Indus Basin. There are periods of droughts when the snow period is very small, and then the uncertainty of rain water also means that before the snow becomes ice and part of the glacier, it melts because of both rain and so forth. And because of gloughs that you referred to, there are constant, unending tragedy happening for the ecosystem as well as for the communities that live there. God has given them the capacity to foresee from the noise and the movement of their animals and birds that the gulf is about to happen. So the people who were settled there for centuries have become nomadic, so to speak. There's a constant movement of the local communities back and forth. Now, having said that, one can go on. A net result is, while the flows of the river have maintained a certain band of averages over a longer period of time, the exact predictability in smaller weeks and months has become a bigger challenge.
I think, as you already hinted at, one of the key issues now is that climate change had been creating a lot of incidents like gulfs, sudden flash flooding as well. And this has sort of weakened disaster preparedness, particularly from an angle of governmental administrators and institutions. Do you think that the lack of data can also sort of further create issues when it comes to disaster preparedness? What could potentially, as you mentioned, that there are traditional practices where the communities can sense it. What additionally can we do to secure sort of their living in terms of increased risk from disaster?
Data is an exaggerated issue in my view in Pakistan. They have always had trouble in obtaining data sets in a timely fashion from India, and it has become even harder in recent decades. If the data that is available on Indian websites, if I try to access it from a domain, Pakistani domain, it will be denied to me, but I can access the same data from another domain internationally from elsewhere. So it's much harder for Pakistan, and it has been for several years. Having said that, that while India-Pakistan data relations under Indus Waters Treaty and otherwise have been very weak and becoming weaker. The absolute dearth of data is not there. Satellite imagery tells us and satellite data do tell us rain pattern flows. It gives us data about the filling of the reservoirs. It gives us a fairly decent data about the surface water flows and the warning system that previously the communities didn't have, except for their own traditional systems. Uh, it is accessible to them on mobile phones to just about everyone. And not just that, WMO, World Meteorological Organization, has regional softwares that Pakistani meteorological department or other meteorological departments access, and that gives us early warning systems. And Pakistan's early warning system capability has increased tremendously. On flood warning, we are always relatively weak, and we have become weaker in last few years, and that is partly because India doesn't give us data, and partly because of erratic monsoons. It's not available in ordinary fashion. Ordinary fashion is very nice way to explain that. That when the water enters Pakistani Punjab, we know that how many days it will take to reach Sindh. So they have more or less warning period of 2 weeks. So that's an ordinary pattern of flow that somebody sitting in India in Sindh can monitor. But what if India or Pakistan both don't know that a torrential rain or cloud outburst would have, resulting in inundation downstream? What if they don't have, as it happened in Uttarakhand, or it happened in Salkot, or it happened in Nowshera? In recent years, we have seen that. That is a climate-triggered challenge. So I don't think if India-Pakistan treaty is in abeyance and data exchange becomes weaker, it does not necessarily mean that a logical outcome would be weaken Pakistan's ability to manage disasters. I think there are alternatives available. Pakistan is already using many of those very efficiently, and I think we'll need to augment that capacity or our internal relationships, as well as our own satellites and partnership with other satellites that can provide us that information in a timely fashion to the decision makers as well as other stakeholders such as university scholars and media and academia.
I'm glad that you touched on the idea that the treaty itself does not mean that a lot has been limited in case of what Pakistan can do for disaster awareness and governance. And that also brings me to the question that there is sort of criticism of the IWT as well, that given that it was signed in the 1960s, it did not really contextualize the impacts of climate change that we see today. It was not recorded in it in any form that what could be the precautions taken if the river patterns change, the monsoon becomes erratic, if the glacial melt increases. So do you think that the treaty itself actually needed to have additional components, or at least some guidance between the two countries has to come in the form of managing the basin or the rivers more sustainably together? Perhaps evolution of the treaty itself, a new agreement, or annexing more documents, or these sort of discussions are happening. But from a climate perspective, what can potentially be done for better river management in this region?
See, you're absolutely right. At the time when treaty was signed, there was no scientific understanding of climate change in the region and for the treaty negotiators from both countries. And it is surprising that it does not mention not only the word climate change, but for that matter, ecosystems either. So it's not an environmental treaty. It does not mention minimum flows or environmental flows for the 3 rivers that were given to India. However, Article 7 of the treaty is about discussing issues that may come up from time to time. And many of those issues, this is about joint research and collaboration and identifying new issues that emerge. And we have never invoked Article 7. India has not invoked that Article 7 either, as far as I know. Therefore, cancelling or putting the treaty in abeyance without Article 7 is in itself a weakness of their claim. But from the Pakistani side, we have known about climate change for at least 3 decades. Pakistan's policy documents mentioned the need for research on climate change in 1992-93, when we first printed National Conservation Strategy. One of the core recommendations was research, and that we could have translated into our negotiators raising the joint research and data exchanges or other issues that are relevant for climate from climate change point of view under Article 7. The only word that has in subsequent years become more important is the issue of water body pollution, and the word pollution is mentioned for river Ravi. And Pakistan has a complaint that the tributaries of Ravi, such as Nala Dek, Nala Ek, and other nalas, they bring heavy load of pollution from India. And that's covered under the treaty, but as far as I know, Pakistan has not raised that also. So therefore, Article 7 is one of those underutilized clauses of the treaty that, if applied, could have helped us make treaty a dynamic and a robust treaty. It may have been a wonderful treaty in 1960s, but then the two parties, they were responsible it was their responsibility to make it a dynamic treaty, to cover new issues they were coming, such as cloud outbursts, such as the seasonal variability, such as the increasing population, such as the load of sedimentation load that's filling our dams and so on and so forth. Rate of deforestation in both countries, the rate of changing pattern of snowfall in upper reaches of Indus Basin and others. There were a host of other issues that we could have discussed under Article 7. And that findings could have been annexed to the treaty with mutual consent. Now, having said that, my optimism tells me treaty may be dead or put in abeyance, but it does not necessarily mean that the issues have disappeared. I think it is a challenge for us sitting in Pakistan as a lower riparian, as a weaker country, and in such a charged environment. It is on us extraordinary responsibility how some of those issues that I mentioned should become part of our agenda with India outside the treaty also. An important point, background to this is our very important one. We made our water relations with India subservient to the treaty. There were many more issues that were emerging that were not covered under the treaty as we just discussed. So I think there was a space available to Pakistan, just the way we were discussing trade and we were discussing Kashmir and terrorism and also further issues. We could have discussed other emerging issues outside the treaty. And then at a political level, when there is an understanding, then you wink to your negotiators that you can commission joint studies or not. So there was a way for us to build. And I think with or without treaty, still as a lower riparian, it is in our interest that these issues find space in our scientific research in Pakistan, in our collaborative research with our partners in Australia and UK and US and elsewhere at the universities where Pakistani students go and graduate, doing graduate studies and dissertations there. And UK professors have an important role to play because they can have a student doing his PhD on these issues from Pakistan and also from India. And they're doing their dissertation, they're not policymakers, but that way we develop a comparable understanding in both issues. Sorry, it's a longer answer, but what I'm trying to say is that the life of Pakistan does not end with the treaty. And putting in abeyance means it may be in abeyance for a month or for 3 decades. Legally India may be wrong and it may be illegality. But politically, if they do not want to be in a treaty relationship, it will not become a functional one. So as a measure for us to mitigate our risks as a sovereign, we want to say, okay, Indus Water Treaty is one track, but we have several other issues that we need to discuss even outside those. And these issues that you just raised are critical issues, and we will need to discuss them.
Understood. I think that's very helpful to contextualize now. The issues over the years have become so many that the IWT perhaps wasn't being utilized enough to actually deal with them. I think
Just one point I can make, maybe this is not the only transboundary river, and this is not the only transboundary treaty. If we look at globally, there are more than 200 shared basins. And there are more than 250 transboundary rivers. And then there are more than 300 agreements or treaties between nations. For us, it's one, and it's very important and very critical. It's very unfortunate that India did illegality arbitrarily. But for us as a lower riparian, there's a learning opportunity from us, from other experiences that I just mentioned to you.
Thank you. That was Ali Tauqeer Sheikh explaining the nitty-gritties of the Indus Water Treaty, and of course the various particular elements that built this treaty and how it had so far been used both by Pakistan and India, the limitations within the treaty, and also areas which could have been used for collaboration and sustainably managed in ministerial base. And of course, he does point out that even with the breakdown of this particular treaty, does not mean for Pakistan as a country to stop investing in its infrastructure and research around water and the industrial base. We've spoken about treaties, we've spoken about climate change, legalities of Indus Water Treaty as well. But let's take a step back. This is a moment of reckoning for both India and Pakistan. Consequences of this breakdown could possibly be catastrophic, especially for the communities that depend on the Indus. Indus Water Treaty, which has gone for 60 years, through conflicts, supermarket breakdowns, has been thrown out of the window. Now, this shows you how fragile water security can be for countries in the global south. But for both countries, water stress is a serious issue. Be it Punjab, India, be it Punjab, Pakistan, be it Sindh in Pakistan, be it other regions of India, Bangladesh, and most of South Asia, water security is a key threat. And given that this is a drought here, already in the water stress issues, what both countries are overlooking is water stress as well as the erratic patterns that we're seeing. Be it extreme flooding, we saw the monsoon in India and Uttarakhand, Himalayan regions, massive flooding. Similarly, 2022 Pakistan saw the super floods in Sindh. Given the nature of climate change and how water is at the center of it all, we really need to work together and get past conflicts, rivalries, to ensure that water security, water management is one thing that does not get disturbed. It's easy to use water as a weapon. However, both India and Pakistan really need to rethink this situation. Indus Water Treaty might have its limitations, might need an evolution to include the subjects of climate change, ecosystems, biodiversity into it. However, there is no alternative. Indus itself needs to be protected, both from ecological damage as well as it being used as a weapon at conflicts. You've been watching Front Seat to Climate Change. To watch the full episode, head over to DawnNews English on YouTube. And join me next Sunday, 11 p.m. for more in-depth information, discussions, deliberations about climate change. Goodbye.